Hello students, welcome back the another video section of object oriented programming using C++. On the previous classes or video classes, we learn about what is programming language, what are the different type of programming languages available there, and why more than one programming languages existing in computing world. So on the previous video classes, you know that what is programming and as well as what is programming languages. Basically, the object-oriented programming language widely implemented nowadays because of its features or benefit to the developer or programmers. So in this section, we just learn about object-oriented programming using C++. So first, as you know that every individual programming or programming language should fulfill the basic requirements of developer, programmer or user. So on first year, you learn about the programming language C. On the previous video or on the previous video class, what is procedural programming and what is object oriented programming or scripting programming language we learn about. So in this particular section, we just focus about the programming language C++. As you know that C is basically the base language or the foundation language of any beginner or any never user, or you can say standard user. So that's why there are certain particularly layering concepts there. So first of all, as you know that the machine language was widely implemented during that era, and after that the assembly language was available. Then the structure oriented or programming language is available, and after that the object oriented programming language are available for developing variety of programs. So basically C++ is not a purely object oriented language but a hybrid that contains the functionality of the C programming language. The very first point says that your C++ programming is not completely or purely object oriented programming. It means like all the features of the C programming are widely implemented in C++. So there are a certain layering concept. First of all, we should normally know about algol, that is algorithm based, and after that B language is there, that is first testing language for the structure oriented programming, and after that B becomes C, that is C language. And as you know that C language is basically called procedural or structure oriented programming. What is procedural or what is structural oriented programming? On the previous particular video class, we learn about that particular thing. And during that particular era, one programming language called Simula 67. This particularly programming was world's first object-oriented programming language. And there are certain features from C and as well as C++ to develop the programming language called C++. So in this case, plus plus is nothing. It is called C plus 1. As you know that plus plus is normally called one operator, that is normally called first plus and followed by 1 plus, that is plus 1. So that's why like num plus plus, that is num equal to num plus 1. So in this case, C plus plus is nothing. C with classes. The additional feature which is added to the C programming, that is called the class concept. It is the most important term or or you can say the characteristics or the features of C++ programming. So that's why your C++ is not a completely object-oriented programming. Nowadays, we are normally focused about like programming Java programming. And Java program is completely based on object-oriented programming. That's why it is basically called purely object-oriented programming. The reason is that all the subsequent features of the object-oriented programming should implement in a particular program, or the complete structure of the program is completely based on object-oriented programming. That is basically called truly or purely object-oriented programming. Although C++ is object-oriented programming or object-oriented programming language or object-oriented language, but some of the features are not widely implemented. Means some of the object-oriented features are not widely implemented to develop a program in C++. That's why it is basically called the extension of C language. That's why the large quantity of existing C language source code can also be used in C++ programming. Basically, every individual object-oriented programming is normally based on two subsequents, particularly like terms. That is, one thing is called class, another thing is called object. But in C++, it is normally called the extension of C language. Why? Because in C++, all the subsequent features, like you can say the syntax and sorts of things, are widely implemented. So that's why C++ is a general purpose programming language and widely used nowadays for competitive programming. So basically in C, one particular concept called structure. So the structure was normally little bit modified to convert into the class concept, and the class which is used in C++ is not like using complete feature of the object-oriented program. That's why it is basically not purely object-oriented program. So the most particularly concepts of the subsequent syntax and as well as the general forms normally adopt from the C language to normally develop the C++ language. So C++ run on lots of platforms like Windows, Linux, Unix, Macintosh, etc. Like any other programming language, like C is also widely implemented with variety of operating system. C++ is also supports the variety of platforms or variety of operating systems like Windows, Linux, Unix, Macintosh, so on so forth. So it is widely implemented or widely like designed or developed variety of operating systems. And the next point says that C++ supports different way of programming like procedural, like object oriented, like functional, and so on. So although C++ is object oriented programming, but it can support the traditional programming, like it may be in C, like you know that the functional concepts and as well as the procedural concept widely implemented that. So that's why C++ normally called the extension or the superset concept of the previous programming. That's why it can support variety of particular different type of programming like procedural, like object oriented, and as well as functional programming language. On the previous particularly video section, we learn about what is procedural programming, what is object oriented programming, what is functional oriented programming. So that's why in this case, like I said earlier, C++ is an extension of C language and was developed by present startup at Bell Labs. So this particularly like programming language, as you know that C is normally developed by Dennis Ritchie. Similarly, this particularly programming, that is C++ programming language, was developed by Razin Stato at Bell Labs. So that's why C++ is an intermediate level language, as it consists or comprises a conformation of both high level and as well as low level language. So it can support the high level programming and as well as the low level programming to develop or to design a subsequent program. That's why it is basically called an intermediate, in between intermediate level language. As you know that basically there are like number of particularly layering of programming language there. One thing is called HL, that is called high level language. Another thing is called low level programming or low level language. So it can actually provide some of the mechanism of high level and as well as the low level program. And next is called the major difference with the major difference in object oriented programming. Like concept is C++ is an object oriented language, whereas C is normally called the procedural language. As I say in the previous class also, like C is normally called the procedural programming language because it normally focuses about the functions or the procedures. But in C++, it normally emphasizes on or focus on data rather than the procedure. In this case, this is basically called the function. So all the object-oriented features in C++ like abstraction, encapsulation, inheritance, and as well as polymorphism, there are large number of particularly object-oriented features there that is widely implemented in this case, that is in particular C++. That's why it makes it more worthy and as well as useful for the programmer, because the real world programming concept is normally based on object-oriented programming. Means it's completely based on objects. So that's why on the previous class also or previous video class also, we just learn about what is the object. Object is nothing. It is a combination of two things. One thing is called data, another thing is called function. So your object is equivalent to or object equal to your data followed by your particularly function. So in this case, there are certain particularly like object-oriented features there. Like this particularly concept we'll learn about on the next particular video. So abstraction is there, encapsulation is there, inheritance. These are normally called the real life or real world normally features, which is widely implemented to develop a subsequent program. So in particularly C++, variable can be declared anywhere in the program in C++. And you know that your C particular programming language having two types of variable. One thing is called global variable, which is defined normally initially as by using the hash directive concept, and next is normally called the local variable, which is normally implemented inside a particular function or a procedure. So your in C++, the variables can be declared anywhere in the program, but must be declared before they are used. As you know that whenever we define a particular variable, and after that we can manipulate the subsequent value for the variable. So whenever you use the subsequent variable, before that it should be normally declared in subsequent program. So this particular section, like what is variable, what is token, so on so thing, we are normally discussing on normally coming classes. So this is basically called one difference between like the sum of the particular difference between procedural programming and as well as object-oriented programming. On the left side, you are having there are 4 subsequent points there, and on the right side, object-oriented programming having there are 5 points there. So first of all, as I said earlier, like your procedure programming language is basically called the list of instructions for a computer to follow. So it is normally called a step-by-step sequence or a sequential process of programming. That's why it is basically called top-to-bottom approach. And groups of similar tasks are organized as functions. As you know that function is called a building block inside a program. Number of statements are normally combined to form a subsequent group, and that particular group is basically called procedure, or it may be also known as function in any other programming, like it is also having in C. And most functions set global data. So global data can be shared by the most of functions in this particular case, like in procedural programming, and the data is publicly available. The most significant or the most actually you can say the problematic concept is there, that is the data, because the data is normally publicly available. So it is not highly secure. So whenever we normally change certain contents or certain values of the subsequent data, that is you can say in this case variable, it is easily changed. So that's why there are certain lack of security concept there in procedural programming language. But on the other side, the object-oriented programming, it emphasizes on data because it normally focuses upon the data, not on the subsequent procedure. Because procedure is basically called publicly specified, and the data is basically called privately specified. So that's why it is normally in object-oriented programming, the developers are normally focused upon the language developer are normally focused upon the data. It is not actually on the basis of procedure, because procedure is something that is called the, you can say, the organizing or similar task of group or similar task group, which is organized as a particular function as I said earlier. So in this case, it is normally based on data in C++ or object-oriented programming rather than the functions or procedures. So the programs are divided into objects. So in this case, what is object, what is class, we learn normally on the next classes. So basically programs, almost all programs are divided into specific objects. So the object oriented programming language is completely based on object or more than one object through which it can be implemented. So that's why the data structure are designed such that they characterize the object. So in this case, the previous section, like the previous particularly like programming language, that is procedural programming or procedural oriented programming, it is focused about the subsequent functions. But in this case, it is focused about the data. So that's why most of the data structure design like normally focus about on the normally based on the subsequent object. So in this case, functions that operate on the data of object are tied together in that same as the data structure. So the data should be implemented through functions, and functions can be easily normally used outside world. So basically the main purpose of the object oriented programming is basically called to secure that data part that can be used not directly outside. It can be used by the help of like the subsequent functions or you can say subsequent procedures. So in this case, data is hidden because it can secure and cannot be directly accessed. So the data cannot actually direct access by the help of subsequent object in this case. So that's why the data is encapsulated or the data is hidden, and it can be like implemented or it can be assessed by the help of the subsequent functions or the behavior of the subsequent program. So this is basically called simple diagram of object oriented and as well as the procedural oriented programming. So as I say earlier, like the functions of the subsequent particular procedural oriented programming is based on or is focused upon the global data. So more than one particular global data should be defined inside a program, and that should be generated or that should be implemented by the help of functions. So in this case, there are two subsequent global data there, and there are three functions there: the function 1, function 2, and as well as function 3. And all the subsequent particular global data can be accessed by the help of subsequent functions. And every individual function having also its own data, that is called the local data in this case. So that's why there are two types of particularly data can be widely implemented in procedural oriented programming. One thing is called global data, another thing is called local data. So global data, in this case global data, the scope of the global data is throughout the program, but the scope of the local data are normally accessed to the subsequent functions. So that's why if a particular function one having global local data, so the local data can be sorry, global data local data can be widely accessed or widely implemented within the subsequent function itself. So function one having local data that can be widely implemented inside the subsequent function. The scope of the particular local data within that particular function, but in this case global data can be accessed all of the subsequent functions, because it can be accessed through the subsequent program. But on the other side, the object oriented programming, so every individual particular program must have, like in this case that is called class, and every individual class must having its own attributes and as well as the behavior. So in this case the attributes, or you can say attributes, are basically called data, and the behavior of the subsequent particular class is basically called function. So in this case there are three subsequent particularly section there. The first section is all about the data and function, and then second particular section also having data and function, and third also having. So the main communication between the subsequent particularly program, or in this case in object oriented programming, by the help of subsequent class. So the like communication between the function and function. So the data cannot be directly accessed by other particularly class functions. So that's why in this case there are a particular link, like there is a particular link between functions and functions, and as well as functions to functions. So this particular data cannot be directly accessed by this particular function because of data security. So that's why, as I say earlier, data is hidden and it cannot be directly accessed outside. So this is one section, or this is one class, and this is another class, and this is the third third class. So class 1, class 2, class 3 having its own data, and that particular data can be accessed by the help of its own function. So if some particular means other class can access the data of a particular class, it can access the subsequent data of the source that can be used by the help of the subsequent functions. So that's why the main communication between the subsequent data in this case, that is object-oriented programming, is using the number of functions which is defined or which is normally access its own data. And basically, the object-oriented programming in C++, the definition. Object-oriented programming is an approach that provides a way of modularizing, that is called the modules, by creating partitions memory area for both data and as well as function that can be used as a template, that is class, for creating copies of such modules on demand, that is called basically object. So in object-oriented programming, there are two subsequent particular like you can say features what is widely implemented. That is, one thing is called class and another thing is called object. So in this case, just simple छोटा सा example देता हूँ देखो. And belongs to teacher category. So teacher is in this case like you can say like class here. And my name is Vivekanand Bhatnagar. So Vivek is normally called the instances of the class, that is called the teacher class. So basically instances is nothing, it is called the example of the subsequent particular class. So like some particular person, like Vivek is normally called the name of the person. The person is basically in this case, और यहाँ पे आपका वो class हो गया, or as well as the name of the subsequent person is called the instance, or instance is nothing, it is called the example of the subsequent class. So that's why this particular approach, that is object-oriented programming approach, provides a module. Module means it is nothing. A big task can be divided into smaller tasks, and that can be easily like implemented or easily like compiled and as well as interpreted. So, what is actually class and what is the object? We'll learn about on the next video. So that's why basically just little bit focus. It is basically called class is one type of template, or it is normally called one type of blueprint. We can add two subsequent things. One thing is called data, another thing is called function. So like छोटा सा example दे रहा हूँ. I am speaking now. So अभी मैं बोल रहा हूँ. So in this case जो normally talking या speaking जो होता है वो functioning होता है. वो किसका functioning होता है? Basically by the help of the mouth, or you can say by using the fitting of tongues. So in this case, mouth is basically called the attribute. That is basically called, you can say attribute, or it can be data. And by the help of particularly mouth, मैं mouth को use करके, like मैं speak कर रहा हूँ या जैसे कि some particular presentations कर रहा हूँ, it is basically called the functionality of the subsequent particularly like attribute. So every individual particularly class must have it or must divide into two sections. One thing is called data, another thing is called function. So running, like walking, like you can say speaking, these are normally called the functionality of the subsequent attributes. Running by the help of legs. So leg is in this case, it is basically called attributes. So attribute जो होता है ये जैसे कि हम लोग का leg, hand या mouth या eyes या nose जो भी है, these particular things are called a particularly part of a subsequent person, and the person in this case it is called class. And the subsequent attribute, that is called the physical entity. Those जो चीज को हम लोग देख सकते हैं, that is basically called physical entity, and in this case physical entity is called attributes. And as well as by using that particular attributes, we can actually like provide certain functionality to us, and that particular functionality in this case is basically called like behavior. So this is called the functioning part. So every individual class must have it two subsequent things. One thing is called data, another thing is called function, and data should be implemented by the help of or used by the help of its own function. And function can be communicated with other particularly class or other program like directly. But there is no direct particularly access method, or there is no direct connection between one particularly programs or one class data to another class data. There is no communication mode between data to data, and data should be implemented by the help of its own particularly function, and functions can be communicated outside the board. So it is basically called the real world objectives concept. So by using that subsequence particular property of the subsequence class, property in the sense It is basically called the attributes and then the behavior, like that is called data, and as well as the function of the subsequent class. It can use outside or it can be used outside or communicate outside by the help of the subsequent, particularly object. So that's why object is basically in this case is called like instance of the subsequent, particularly class. And the next, some of the particularly concepts which is associated with the object-oriented programming using C++. So there are basically like 7 particularly like characteristics or you can say features of the object-oriented programming: classes and objects, data abstraction and as well as encapsulation, inheritance, polymorphism, dynamic binding, and message passing. So these are normally called the major, particularly you can say the features or the major like concepts which is associated with the object-oriented programming. This section we normally discuss on coming video, that is the next video. So keep learning and keep focusing about the subsequent videos, like what is object-oriented programming, what is C++, and so on. Thank you.